Preseason is nearly upon us, and the Jets and Moose are about to see some big changes to the rosters. Who should we expect to see win spots, and who might have the biggest seasons for both the Moose and Jets? Find out in tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, we are focusing on how the Jets are prepping for preseason here, who might have some really big years for the Moose, maybe which players we expect to have big preseason performances, all that fun stuff. It's going to be a pretty wild ride. And then, of course, I want to talk a little bit about the Athletics article, talking about camp battles that debuted earlier this week. Murat Atesh talked a little bit about what he thought would be the projected roster, and I want to dive into some of those lines and whether they really make sense or if there's perhaps a tweak incoming. Before we dive into all the fun stuff, though, I did want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com and win $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So first, let's chat about, this past weekend. Obviously, we've talked a lot about some really fun stuff with the Moose, and obviously the prospect showdown, I think, was a cool little window into maybe some guys that I wasn't thinking about having big seasons for Manitoba, but they look like they're a little more at the races than anticipated. Now, again, I want to caution, as with all things, when I talk about a 2-game sample size, we're not looking at this as the be-all, end-all, right? This is just sort of a brief window to see where some of the kids are, to get some practice reps and stuff. So I don't want to say that the prospect showdown is going to definitively give you an idea, but I was a little bit surprised, at least by a couple of performances that I wasn't really anticipating. Chief among them, Danny Zhilkin, is a guy that I've really had some time for in previous years. The past couple of seasons with the Moose really haven't gone according to plan, partly due to injury, partly just due to maybe some luck, maybe some struggles to adapt to the pro levels. And I also think the Moose not being that good the last couple of seasons really hasn't helped a ton. The year before last was all right, but this past season, Manitoba was awful. So this year, the Moose are going to be pretty darn deep. This is arguably one of the best rosters that we've seen from them, with guys like Fajimo, Di Giuseppe, Clegg, all these guys joining and coming in, providing a real boost to some already good players. And so I think Manitoba this year, I've said it on a previous episode, but they're going to be a wagon. I fully anticipate this Moose team being a playoff contender. I think that they could potentially have a chance of making some Calder Cup noise. Not that I think they're favorites or anything, but I think they will be a really tough playoff out. So I'm excited for this team. We'll have to see how it translates, but I would be very optimistic about what we see coming out of the season. For guys that I think in the system are going to have big years for the Moose, obviously Brad Lambert will probably start there. I think most of the kids, if not all of them, will be with Manitoba to begin the year. Unless they have a crazy camp, I would expect at least, most of the prospects to start off with the Moose, which is not the worst thing, but I do hope that at least some of them give the coaching staff some food for thought for when call-ups inevitably become a situation. But Lambert will probably have a big year. I think we'll see him bounce back. Chibrikov will probably have a slower start as he works his way back from injury, but eventually throughout the season, I think you'll see the qualities that made him such a really fun player last season. And of the guys who are going to get called up, I think he and Lambert probably have the most likelihood of any sort of injury time to come in and fill in for a Jet. Or if Winnipeg really just needs a change of pace, maybe they bring one of these guys up by waiving one of the veterans. Obviously, we're not talking about Nyquist. Nyquist was brought in to really do a job, and I think he'll be the Ehlers replacement, quote, end quote. But, guys like Pearson and Koepka, I don't think the Jets feel quite as strongly about. We'll have to see. But other guys that I think will be good, of course, Salamanson, I'm expecting a big year from him. Jokin also looks kind of reborn, and if he finally has that season that we've been waiting for, that is really exciting. Jokin is a guy who I think really projects to be a very fun bottom six player. He had some finishing talent. He's got that hard work ethic. I think that's the exact sort of performance that would be great for either a third or a fourth line deployment, especially if he can continue to develop as a solid two-way center. Other guys, I'm really looking at. I think one of the biggest ones for me is Colby Barlow. Barlow has kind of been recently a little bit more of a black box for me, just because there have been parts of his game that I've sort of understood, and parts where I haven't exactly felt like he maybe was the most projectable talent. He has a couple of really sick traits and technical tools, and then there were other parts of his game that were sort of lacking. The skating, I think, has really been a big focus. I didn't notice it as much in this prospects tournament, just because, for the most part, he's going against a lot of his peers. So against pro caliber competition, we'll have to see how it really pans out for him. But, in general, I think he's looking to have a pretty solid season. I think he and probably Jaeger are going to have some growing pains to start this year. But I think in the second half, it wouldn't shock me if both, kind of turn it on maybe a month or two into the season. Maybe they start to really find their footing, and they both end up around 30 to 35 points for the year. Wouldn't shock me. I think it might be a little high for rookies entering their first pro season, but I think both have shown enough flashes to where I think it's definitely possible. I think if that's what they start the season with, that is really impressive. Your first AHL season notching like 30 to 35 points, that's really nothing to sniff at. And if they continue to develop the good pro habits, I would say that's a success. If they don't, necessarily hit those markers, that's okay. A lot of kids coming into their first pro season don't do that well. So, this might be a little bit of a generous expectation. Maybe I'm overestimating it. But based on what we saw, I do think that they've got some real pop. I'm pretty excited to see what they do this year. And if Barlow can really push himself back into, the upper echelons of the prospect pool, I think that would be awesome. Give us some competition. Give us some food for thought. His off-ice and locker room leadership are unquestioned. His release is unquestioned. It's just how will all of his other tools really start to fit into the NHL landscape? And I think that's where maybe there has been some question before. There still could be even now. But so far, I think he's done a lot to improve a lot of his stock and make his name a lot more competitive for some future NHL call-ups. So exciting times for the Moose. I think this is going to be a big year. Fabian Wagner could have a big season. We'll have to see with him. He shows those flashes of being a fun player, and then other moments where maybe you don't see him as much. But if he finds some consistency this year, he could be a very interesting sleeper pick. So again, I think this year for the Moose is going to be big. I think this is probably one of the best Moose teams we've seen in some time. It's not going to be perfect every outing, and I think there are going to be some games where, the kids have a little bit of a tough time. But, what you've got in net with Milic, DiVincentis, and Poulter all fighting for time, plus Worthington now entering the system, this is a very deep squad. They've got some real backing in net, and that could get this team a lot further than you'd ordinarily expect. So look out for the Moose. They should be a wagon this year. Let me know what you're thinking for their season and how far you think they'll go for the playoffs. But of course, I also want to chat a little bit about the upcoming preseason and how all of this sort of fits into the bigger landscape, right? I mentioned that I don't know that any of the prospects are really going to get more than a couple of games at most to start the season. I would expect them to be more call-ups. We'll chat about what that then means for the preseason competition in just a moment. But before we do, wanted to let you know about our friends and partners at Monarch Money. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth. Whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments, it's hard to know what you're worth when you don't have a clear picture. And if you don't, you could leave money on the table. Monarch Money is here to help. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one easy-to-use interface. It's built for people with busy lives, and if you've put off organizing your finances, Monarch is for you. It does the heavy lifting, linking all your accounts and minutes, helping you see clear data visuals, getting smart categorization of your spending, and it helps you finally feel in control of your money without ever touching a spreadsheet. If you are somebody who's got lots of streaming and subscription services, this is a way to cut down on expenditures. Or maybe you've got a partner or spouse in your life that you share accounts with. Monarch Money can merge and help you set financial goals together so you'll always be on the same page. And for those of you who are big traders, this is your chance to make sure that your output is actually bringing in enough to where you've got some really good revenue, you've got, investments that are shining, and that you're not leaving money out there for somebody else to take. So don't let financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNHL. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting a little bit about, the Winnipeg Jets preseason upcoming, just this weekend. I think a lot of us are probably relatively intrigued at what we're going to see. The first game will be on Sunday at 4 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Eastern. And then, of course, the following week, we'll start to really ramp up towards the start of the regular season. You've got about a week or two of preseason hockey, and then you roll into the start of the regular season on the 7th and 9th. So it'll be a good time for the Jets. And I think for fans, we're all looking forward to some level of expectation for this upcoming season, especially with Taves now in tow. This is a big deal for the Jets. It's the biggest free agent signing they've ever had. And so I think that there's a lot of anticipation, expectation, something along those lines. You've heard me sort of talk about this, though, before. To some degree, I expect a little bit of, how do I put this? A bit of a step back compared to last year's team, right? I think this year's squad will be good for the regular season, but I don't think it's going to hit quite the same heights as last season. Kind of hard to match a 116-point, President's Trophy team, or maybe it was a little bit higher than 116. But the Jets, again, I think they'll be good. And I think what I want to see out of preseason is how all of these new veterans impact the overall defensive structure. This year's team is going to be older and slower. I don't think that there's any getting around that. People are like, well, Appleton's gone. They've upgraded. And I don't actually know if that's true. Appleton, look, I know that a lot of people, myself included, were frustrated with Mason at times. And I don't think it was because of him. Appleton, for me, is a guy who was sort of over-relied upon in key situations where maybe you'd need somebody just with a higher level of finishing and offensive talent. Appleton did a lot of good forechecking and defensive work, but, there were other parts of his game that, given the minutes that he played, given what he was asked to do, it was a little bit much for his role. And so with Winnipeg now needing to figure out how to not only replace his defensive impact, but also maybe some of his special teams PKing work, I don't think it's going to be quite as seamless as people are expecting. Koepka could maybe do some of this work, although he's really been brought in for the fourth line. You could potentially see maybe an Iafallo take his spot. Ideally, I think the Jets wanted Iafallo more on the fourth line. That's where they've used him in the past. But I just feel like this team is going to have a lot more of a grindery forechecking sort of approach this year. Given who's going to be moving up the lineup, given the departures, I tend to think that Arniel is going to have a more physically oriented wall battle kind of team, which is fine, but I do think it sort of caps your offensive potential. And so for preseason, I want to see where Taves is. How does he look? He's going to be rusty for a while. I would expect at least a month for him before he starts to really settle in. Beyond that, I don't know what else to really expect here when it comes to a lot of the centers. The Jets are going to have some real battles in camp for the fourth line center spot, probably the third line center role until Lowry comes back. And so, for the Jets, this is a weird moment, I guess. You're going to have some restructured lines. You're going to have some different matchups. Maybe the Jets, through injury, can kind of find something new that they weren't expecting. If there's one thing that I really hope Arniel does more in preseason, it's experiment. This past season, we didn't really see a lot of change in the lines, especially with the top six. And I think that, for me, was a mistake. The top line was good and much better than it was in previous years, But compared to other top lines around the league, it's still a little more middle of the pack. And while middle of the pack is fine, it's not where I think the Jets really need it to be. Winnipeg is not a team that's as deep offensively as a lot of these other squads. And people will say, well, they scored, among the most goals in the league, and that's true. But you have to remember the power play really cooked for the Jets at a nearly historic level. So if you're actually looking at what the Jets did at 5v5, that's really got to be their focus, right? You need to find ways to squeeze out more offense, generate more opportunities to score, and I think the rest will follow. A lot of the teams that tend to go very deep in the playoffs are one of the top Corsi teams in the league. Both Edmonton and Florida were top 5 at times in Corsi, which is just a proxy. Well, not even a proxy. It's just telling you how many shot attempts and stuff you're taking. So if you're taking lots of them and you're doing pretty good work, you're probably a team that is better primed for the playoffs. It's really not rocket science. You can attach whatever name you want to it, but it's a very simple concept. And I think that's where the Jets really need to hammer it home. For preseason, you're going to have battles in the bottom 6. You're going to have some stuff maybe for the second line. But I think Winnipeg is going to try and live and die by this top line. And I wish that they would experiment more. The CSI line, I think, really comes to mind as a trio that worked well, even if it's not the most ideal. Iafallo arguably isn't your typical top line forward, but alongside Scheifele and Connor, they had really good chemistry. And I think given how the Jets want to play and how they need to kind of spread out the wealth a little bit more, that could be a way that you keep both Scheifele and Connor together without sacrificing some of the defensive work. It'll also take a little bit of the pressure off of Vilardi to do that, and maybe let Vilardi actually just blossom at 5v5. I think Gabe on his own is a lot better than what we've seen maybe from him on that top line. When he's asked to do other stuff and sort of back check and be more of that defensive presence, I think it unfortunately takes away from some of the stuff that makes him really special once he's in the offensive zone. So some interesting stuff there. I know how the Jets are, though. I know a lot of this is probably going to fall on deaf ears at the end of the day. I think that's maybe one frustration I've sort of had with Arniel is that there's just not a lot of experimentation. So I hope that we see more of that this preseason. I hope that we see some restructured lines. I think if the Jets legitimately reevaluated how their top 9 was built, I think you could come up with some really interesting combos that compensate for a lot of the areas where the Jets are weak. When you try to do all the stacking of the top line with guys who like to play with each other and stuff, it just doesn't lead to the best outcome. And I think for Winnipeg, they don't win nearly as many of their matchups as they think they do. Their overall record would tell you otherwise last year, but when you look between the margins, you start digging in, you find out that for as many areas as the Jets were strong in, which includes team defense, a reborn power play, and much improved PK, the 5v5 game continued to be a bit of a struggle, and it was all the way through the playoffs. So for the Jets, this is going to be a very interesting season, preseason starting again this coming Sunday. I am looking forward to it. I'm hopeful that maybe we see some changes. I just don't want the Jets to keep doing it the same way that they've always done it. Winnipeg might think that they're better than they are, and that's fine. I think that they're a very strong team in a lot of ways, but I don't see them quite in the elite tier of playoff teams right now, and it'll take some time before they can prove that they are. I think if they really turn it around at 5v5 this year, if they dominate opponents routinely, I'll have a different perspective on it. But given the roster changes and what we're seeing with this team, I don't expect that to be the norm. So we'll have to just hope, right? I think that's really what every season's built on, is just hope. Winnipeg is kind of in this weird spot of maybe retooling on the fly. I really don't know. It doesn't seem like they're really as committed to this roster and year as I would like them to be, considering that this is their 3-year competitive window. But perhaps there is some sort of a surprise at the end of this road. But curious to know what you feel about it. Are you looking forward to the season? Are you kind of like meh on it? Drop your thoughts and feelings below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Now, I mentioned earlier Murat Atesh of The Athletic had his thoughts on some specific camp battles and some proposed lines based on the existing depth chart. I'll talk about that and what I think we're actually going to see coming into the start of the season in just a little bit. But before we do, thought you should hear from our friends and partners at FanDuel. The NFL season is finally here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. If you've been following the NFL action, the AFC North continues to be a dumpster fire. I say this as a Ravens fan. Not been a good time. You see the Bengals on top despite now losing Joe Burrow. But, of course, there are other crazy divisions out there. You've got some stuff in the NFC that's just a hot mess. If I can ever figure out what the Lions are or are not, maybe I'll have a better chance at winning that $300 in bonus bets. But the only way that you can get in on the action is to download the FanDuel app right now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. And if you get your first $5 bet as a win, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to keep your victories rolling right along. Download FanDuel app right now. Hey, friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much for rejoining us on tonight's closing thoughts as we're chatting a little bit about how the Jets are heading into preseason, what we're seeing with this, and, obviously the Jets depth chart is interesting right now. Not so great at center, pretty deep on the wings, and Winnipeg is going to have some legitimate battles between a number of new arrivals and some of their existing, I guess, talent, the existing roster, the current core. And you've also got prospects, right? So there's a whole mixture of things happening. And Murat Atesh of The Athletic put together what he thought you could see some potential line combinations looking like, sort of based on the depth chart, maybe the priority and trust that he thinks these guys individually have. And so his lineup so far looks to be CSV, which no one's shocked by on the first line. Then he's got Perfetti, Taves, and Iafallo on the second. Niederreiter, Nemesnikov, and Nyquist on the third. Barron, Gustafsson, and Koepka for the fourth, with Pearson maybe being your 13th. Now, for me, I don't quite think Gustafsson actually makes it. I am like 99% sure Gus will be the 13th. Pearson, Barron, and Koepka maybe for your fourth. I just have to be honest. I don't think the coaching staff really likes Gustafsson. Unless there's really been a big change in philosophy, the way I see it, this is going to be one of those vet-heavy teams. And for whatever reason, Gus just doesn't seem to have as much of an appreciation from Arniel as I would expect. Gus does a lot of the really hard forechecking work and stuff, and so maybe there's a surprise here. Maybe he does actually get that 4C slot, but I would expect it to be Barron. If Gus does play, it'll be on the wing. Barron has generally, in my mind, been given the preference at 4C. I think he's been okay at times, really good in some games, not very good in others, and so you just have this real mixed bag of what you've been getting from Morgan on and off during the season. He'll have a couple of weeks where there's like some really strong plays, and then a couple of weeks where you don't really notice him that much. And so it doesn't really matter to me who takes on this role. But honestly, I thought Gus really deserved a longer look last season and more time, maybe in some of the spots when you've had injuries. I still think that he's got more in the tank than just being a fourth-line center, but, Winnipeg's probably not going to be the team that feels that way anytime soon. As far as the middle six is concerned, I actually think we might see Nemesnikov at 2C first. They know he's the typical known quantity. He's already established as the 2C from last year, and I don't know that Taves is going to be quite ready. I think Johnny T, as they might say, is going to take some time. Captain Sirius is, coming off of a lot of years of time away from the game. This is his first NHL action in years, literally. So that plus the fact that he had a pretty rough respiratory syndrome from COVID, long COVID, is going to be harder to kind of figure out what his actual game's going to be like. So he's a huge mystery. I would actually think he's going to start on the third line, and I would expect Iafallo and Nyquist to swap. I think Nyquist really was brought in to be that finisher that Ehlers was supposedly. They're just not really comparable players to me, so I don't quite understand how the Jets plan to make this work, but, all power to them. They'll have to figure it out. Not my job. So, I think Nyquist will be helpful on the power play. I think at 5v5, though, I don't know that he's going to have quite the same wheels that you need him to when you look at an Ehlers. But I think the biggest thing that you're noticing here is that there's no kids. All of the rookies are likely to be with Manitoba, and I think that's going to be, generally speaking, the way it goes. Even Parker Ford, I don't think really has much of an inside track to his spot here. Little bit disappointing. I think if the Jets go vet heavy again, it's fine, right? Like for the regular season, it's just fine. But I've often said that this team doesn't graduate prospects fast enough to really turn over some of those depth positions. So then they keep signing guys like Pearson and Koepka to fill in those gaps. And again, it's not a problem, but I think the Jets have already kind of limited their potential offensive ceiling. And if you're not really going to give games to Lambert or Chibrikov or guys like that at some point, then you're just going to have to sort of expect that when you get to the playoffs, what you are is what you are, unless you make a big game-changing trade deadline trade. And like looking at how this last deadline went and what this roster still needs heading into this season, I don't know that the deadline's actually going to be all that productive for Winnipeg. I don't think you can find enough to fill in the gaps of what the Jets actually need. You still need a real 2C that you can like confidently rely on. You still need some real fast wing support. I just don't see how this team is going to find enough on the market to actually overhaul this roster and make this top 9 a lot more competitive. Maybe I'm wrong about this. I've been wrong about stuff in the past, but given what we've seen with what the actual cup winners have compared to what the Jets are rolling out this year, I just don't feel all that confident in this team's overall long-term projection for the postseason. Getting there, I don't really worry about that. I think the Jets will absolutely make the playoffs at some point. I think it'll be maybe a little closer than it was last year, but I don't feel too worried about that whole thing. But yeah, this team's going to be in a weird spot. I mean, it sort of feels like you've got this sort of maybe interim season, where you don't really have a lot of elite offense. You've got a lot of veterans. You've got a couple of rookies who are going to be trying to fight their way onto the team from call-ups, and not a lot else happening. So the Jets might need to make some sort of a power play here at some point, make a big swing on a player who's perhaps frustrated with their existing organization, but would be willing to come to the Jets. I don't know that there's a lot of those guys out there. The Jets are probably not making many trades to begin with. So all I can say is I would set your expectations within reasonable bounds of the season. I don't think this is going to be an elite team by any stretch of the imagination. I think they're going to be elite at a couple of key things. I think those key things will help them get into the playoffs, have a pretty strong regular season record. But once they get into the playoffs, that's where I think a lot of the issues are going to show up. So curious to know how you're feeling about all this. Are these camp battles something that you feel like the Jets are kind of not actually giving fair enough chances to some of the kids for? Drop your comments below or at my social media at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. On Thursday and Friday, we'll have some thoughts from camp and stuff, maybe some early practice lines. We'll see you then, though. For tonight, that's all the time that we have. Thanks for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets go.